Eva, it strikes me, when we look back as an artist, we look back to the very beginnings of our practice, and the very beginnings even actually of imagining being an artist, because it's very often those initial impulses that become foundational to our work. So I wonder when you decided to become an artist, when you thought you might be an artist or become an artist, and perhaps was there a specific occasion or a specific event that might have triggered that thought?
Well, I don't know. I don't think I never made a deliberate decision to become an artist, because I was a very curious. I was a bit of a loner as a child, but I was a very curious child, and it came very naturally. I drew till I was even a teenager. I had these diaries where I was, drawing. But I was also encouraged by my family. I mean, I never had anybody putting, trying to dissuade me to do something else. So, and my father really encouraged me, I have to say, to be creative and, being an architect and a collector. So it sort of came with how we were brought up, Yes, of course. I mean, at one point, like you become a bit more conscious about, what kind of future awaits you and what you want to do with that future. So I went to theater school at a very young age. Yeah, I was 17, so it's pretty young. And I guess again it was a kind of decision by my parents to send me to the conservatoire to study theater. And I only stayed there 1 year because I already had some kind of expectations or maybe ideas of what art could be about. And being the conservatoire, it was very classical. I had, we did Molière and, like Pélias and Mélisandre and this romantic kind of, plays. And so I shifted a little bit sideways, and I was not going to go into acting anyway. That was not my, my thing. So I got interested in stage design, but again, it wasn't satisfactory. I mean, for me I wanted more freedom. And I wanted to have a little bit more latitude than this. It was a little bit academic, and so I just segued into visual arts from and again in Quebec the system allows you to do like these pre-college, these pre-university studies. So I did that in visual arts, and I had very interesting professors. Some Eastern European professors, and it kind of opened up like a whole, a whole lot of possibilities for me. And I knew I was in the right place. So it was never like as I say, it wasn't a big decision I had to make. I didn't have to choose between wanting to be this or wanting to be that. It's I have to say it came naturally, and I kind of found my way in there, and it was it suited me fine. And I kind of think about what else I would have done.
Do you have a thought about what art can do, or did you at the time think about that?
Not really. Honestly, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't, I didn't give it that, I didn't think about it the way I think about it today after, doing it for 35 years. I mean, I have a very different idea about now what art can do. I just, I felt it was like like freedom of expression for sure, and it could, could better lives, but not in a, not in a very precise way, I think I felt the importance of art, that art was something important, and again, because I felt that from very early on, within the context I grew up in, but I didn't think about it like I think about it today, which is kind of like, today I would say it challenges the conventions of seeing, I mean, as an artist, I mean, I think artists see things very differently. I pay attention you know. I pay attention, artists pay attention to, not necessarily to, you know, what's I guess the result of making a work of art. I just, you know, I just pay attention all the time to very small occurrences, to small events, to objects, to space, to light, to textures, to, you know, it's part of my, you know, it's part of my daily life, and I think that's you know, like it's a way, it's just a way of seeing the world, you know, and it becomes like almost habit, you know. I mean, I can see possibilities in people walking down the street, or that flock of birds that just flew outside the window here, the configuration of, you know, there's something in there, and I feel privileged to kind of see a potential in there, a possibility.
So that's not necessarily tied to the revolutionary notions of the classical avant-garde. It's more a kind of daily, a quotidian experience.
Say that again. What kind of experience?
So a quotidian, like a.
Oh, quotidian.
normal.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You know what? I think I don't want to pretend. You know. I think I'm drawn very, you know, very intuitively towards, you know, towards something that, you know, eventually can become, you know, a subject for my work, but I never know when this is happening, and it finds its way back in the work, and that can be, as I say, like the configuration of geese flying south, or it can be like in the way the moon reflected one night on the glass surface of the glass table on the lawn, you know. I mean, they're like these kind of like little events that become like small revelations, and eventually can find or never find a way into the work. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, my art doesn't come from a theoretical background. I do not say I will do my work about this or about that. I never have, and I still do not. I see the context, you know, I mean, the work belongs to a context, and I realize that very often after the fact. Or what somebody says about it, you know, or somebody writes about it, and, you know, people have taught me things about my own work, you know. And I find that fascinating, but it never precedes the action of creating. No.
And there's a phrase that I find interesting, and I wonder how you feel about it with respect to this question of what art can do, perhaps, but also perhaps more especially with respect to your core interests. And the phrase that I've come across is that in some respects your work is devoted to the urgency to shed light and sense onto the disarray of the world we live in. Would that seem to be too...
Are you quoting me?
I don't think so. It's something else, but it's an interesting
I understand what you're bringing forward. Yes, I think one tries to look for a sense of order, but within that order, I welcome the unexpected. I don't think my work is so much about disorder. I work with space. I'm interested in orchestrating objects, images, you know, textures, surfaces in space, and you know, for me that implies already a certain sense of order. You know, it's like it would be like placing bodies. You know. And while doing that, I'm very aware of the space, for example, an object takes in a place. You know, the space, the chair, you know, as an example. The chair I'm sitting on, the space it commands in the space I'm in. So when I arrange the elements of my work, I'm very, very sensitive to that. And this brings me to the subject of quality, because I don't necessarily think of space just as something physical. For me, space has quality. For me, space functions almost as matter. And that's something that has to do as much, about experiencing space physically than sensing space. And I think, the more I reflect on my work in the past and still what I'm doing now, maybe that's my core interest, is to arrive at creating a space that's palpable. And perhaps this is the reason why I have very little work that is single. I mean, I've defined myself for a long time as a sculptor. So, but as a sculptor, I very rarely did single objects. I mean, these objects always cohabited with other objects. And this sort of like mobilization of space is very, very important to me. So one doesn't exist without the other. And now I'm using images, but for me, images are not pictures. That's just another space. There's a different type of space. And it's a space you enter, as much as you enter a room.
Well, it's interesting that you studied theater design, especially stage design. Do you think that early experience gave you, you might say, grounding for what you described?
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. But I never want to illustrate anything. I mean, I've really stayed away from, really deliberate representation, or I've been always very suspicious. And I'll do I'm using, recognizable, elements now. I mean, it's just an evolution in the work, but I still do not see them. I always look beyond representation when I hope my audience looks at the images I use beyond what they represent, because they're not about, they're about something else.
That's interesting, because I guess when you go to the theater, that people are looking at the actors, they're looking at the movement, the narrative and such. But of course they're also looking at something perhaps they don't see, which is the design of the elements within the stage, the space that is being constructed.
Which is, in the theater, it's to a certain degree functional. I mean, like a traditional stage set is like, it tries to emulate something real, and it kind of has a, it has a function. I think the space my objects occupy has, functions differently. Where, the audience is part of. For me, it's very important also that in French, c'est le parcours, it's like how, in that placement of elements, it's how do we meander through that space? I mean, how do we approach the work? I once did a very large installation in one of my first museum installations, where I actually worked totally against approaching the work frontally. I closed the entrance with a 40-foot long curtain, so you only could go towards the piece through the wings, to the left or to the right. So I cancelled out this frontality. But I deliberately, made you walk in a certain manner. Perhaps that has to do with, actors on stage as well. I don't know, to some degree, yeah. I think about how one approaches the work certainly in a gallery situation, or when I show the work, I think about that. Very, very, yeah.
Back to this question of one's core interests, and of course, speaking from the point of view of an artist who works with space, you talked about the spatial construct, but I'm also aware of the fact that you've used the figure of Faust frequently in your work. And if we think of Faust, we think of the sin of pride, we think of Well, Faust.
I was waiting for that question.
Well, I guess it's an inevitable question, Eva, considering the power with which you've constructed for us the image of Faust, especially perhaps through Goethe. But would you like to talk about that in terms of your interests?
Well, Faust for me represented a quest for knowledge, the desire to know, and to the point of sacrificing one's soul for knowing. And I think as an artist, you're in a constant state of quest. Like you look for possibilities, and there's no end to that. I mean, I never look at art as as having a finality. It's bereft of answers. So Faust represented that for me. And one of the titles of the second Faust piece I did was like Faust de la tentation du possible. These titles meant to lead you into that kind of, I suppose, content. But they were very abstract pieces, To a certain degree, they were quite abstract, or the spell, this idea. The first Faust one was about what was the title of it? It had something to do with spell, with a spell, and the kind of, I don't like the word magic, but also the piece called Mirabilia. Mirabilias are like they're like wonders. This idea of the wonder of the spell. I think that was the extent of it for me. I certainly didn't want to illustrate Faust. Perhaps at the very beginning when I got involved in working, from Goethe, from those texts, it was basically returning to. Somehow I had to dig into my roots. I had to. I was sort of questioning where I come from, and coming from that background, I just wanted to go a little further into that. But in terms of a way of thinking, in terms of perhaps more philosophy, it's like this way of thinking, and perhaps that was this is one of the reasons why I was very when I don't like to, the source material, of course, in one's work, one goes to certain sources. And I think going back to that source led me, it probably came from my interest in Joseph Beuys. I believe so, yeah. Because he's an artist that I was very fascinated by, and again, being of German origin, it helped me to go back in that mode of thinking, and Beuys was very interested in Goethe, but Beuys was was not just an artist. I mean, he was like he was a thinker, he was a philosopher, he was a social activist, he was like a shaman, a magician, and this sort of like this all-encompassing image of an artist I was very attracted to. And to the point where this is like really going back into my past, where I was going, my intention was, to go and study with Beuys at the Düsseldorf Academy, and circumstances made it that I did otherwise, but I really, I went to Beuys lectures, and I was, I was really fascinated by this artist, and I think I came to Faust through that. Yeah.
That's interesting. Turning back from Faust, perhaps, but to something a little bit more that perhaps lies below the surface of the Faustian narrative. I came across an oblique reference to Cristeva in the form of a quote, the quote being, with respect to your work, the power of the image that lurks within, which would take us into below the surface of normal life, into
another dimension. Well, that's what I mean, that images go beyond representation, you know. And not just images, I mean, you know, like I guess the spaces I conjure up. See, for example, I was talking about like, you know, the quality of a space. And the quality of a space for me is like could call it an aesthetic of atmosphere. You know, it has to do with something that is palpable. It has to do with mood. And this is of importance to me. It's it's vehicled through, you know, through all sorts of ways. I mean, it's vehicled through the images. It's vehicled to the material the objects are made of. Because if you think about my work, the material is very present. But the material for me is not just like you know, a piece of cloth or you know, a piece of, you know, like steel or whatever this work is made of. I think material, I see material as, you know, material has depth, material has density, material has like, you know, like either absorbent opacity or is permeable, like you know, that element that you see here where, you know, it's not a mirror, but it's a surface that when, you know, that permeates an image. I mean, you know, that flue that exists within it. I mean, it goes far beyond this object. But it's very paradoxical, because one thinks about surface as something on the surface, right? As something very, you know, superficial sometimes. But for me, surface has depth. It goes beyond what you see. So I could say I could phrase it that way. I'm interested in material visuality, you know, which is more than just like the quality of a material. And through that, you know, through that substance, you know, if we can call it a substance, I try to create an atmosphere. I try to create you know, like I think objects should be sensed. You know, my apprehension of space is sensory. You know, one should experience space through you know, also through the senses, not just through the eye. So it'd be like you know, maybe a shift, you know, from the optic to the haptic. You know, this other kind of like my relationship to things. You know, what is my, you know, I think about that, but in the world, I mean, what is our relationship to things? You know, not just to art objects. I mean, to anything that you know, that cohabits with us. You know, and I question this, or I'm aware of this. I reflect on it.
There's another phrase. I'm sorry if I'm throwing up phrases
Yeah.
too early, but they're quite fetching and I think evocative. And there's another phrase which was to describe your work, a moving, constant moving between the object's apparition and dissolution.
Well, I believe in the concept of mobility, and I think the work changes in relationship to where you stand. You know, and again, I was talking before about, you know, the perforation in this piece. If you stand, I mean, in the gallery, this is a studio situation. I can't set it up like I would show it in you know, like in its sort of resolved version, if you want to call it that way. If you are at in a certain perspective, if you stand behind this tall element here, you will see the eye of the bird through that perforation, but only for a moment. If you shift your head, it's gone. So this would be apparition and dissolution, the same way when if I stand in front of this sort of buffed surface, I'm reflected strangely in there. So I become image, and I become part of. You know, my reflection becomes part of. But if I move, it's gone. So maybe that's an instance of apparition and dissolution. You know. It can happen differently, you know, because it's a partially reflective surface. Of course, I mean, one can speak about dissolution of image, but again, because I'm interested in how you apprehend the work. It's like what appears beyond like that physical, that physical encounter. I've been thinking about this in terms of like the way I present images now, because my images are, they're overscaled. These images of, like you have here on the wall. I mean, this oversized creature. But the way I frame my work, this is just a test piece, but the way I frame images, very often the frames are asymmetric. They're not centered. And for me, the gaze of the animal here, he's looking sideways. I mean, he's like, it's a profile. So for me, it will make sense that the border is wider on one side than on the other. So they become openings, the apertures, the windows, and they allow you in a way to project beyond the surface of the image into, I guess, into the imaginary, what it conjures up to as a place. Yeah, not a space, a place. Yeah.
I'm interested by your reference to borders, and of course that brings up the question of antecedents, art history. Antecedents?
Oh, antecedent, yeah.
Art history. Do you have?
Well, I thought about that. There's art history and the history of art, and those are the different. Because art history is something much more encompassing, much wider, and well, it's the way I think about it. And there's resonances. One can find resonances in art history, which is a context éloigné. It's like for me it's a further context. And probably sometimes a context that wouldn't be relevant today in terms of like, if I think about Egyptianism, for example, relevant, yes, because it's been revisited, but not in our lifetime. So, if I think about the history of art, for me, I think about it differently, because for me the history of art is something much more recent, So I think about, like where does my work belong in the, in the history of recent art, contemporary art. But contemporary art, also modern art, and but it's a shorter span. I think about it in a shorter span of time than I would think about, about art history. You're going to ask me the question, where does it belong to in a shorter span in the history of contemporary art?
Well, it does occur to me that the work has to some extent, at least in part, reflected on utopian delusions, maybe those particular to modernism. You may wish to respond to that, I'm not sure, but of course the larger question is there a contemporary discourse, something that, as you say, is bounded more specifically to where we are?
Well, I think a way to talk about this is talking about my formative years, My formative years are the late 70s, the early 80s. And these were like incredibly vivacious years for being an artist. And I think it brought together, it brought together so many art forms. And to the point where it didn't matter. I mean, I graduated as a sculptor, but I'd be hard pressed to call myself a sculptor. I don't care about what I'm called, But I think I very quickly moved away from categorization into seeing this as a kind of like Gesamtkunstwerk, it's like this overall encompassing kind of work that that draws its inspiration from from poetry, from literature, from cinema, from not just from other artists' work, and not just from a period in the history, in the recent history of visual arts. For me, it's something so much larger, And not that my work hasn't evolved. I mean, you know, I think one constantly reinvents the work, you know, and the work has to go, you know, forward, and you know, yes, you need to challenge yourself and put yourself, you know, into a position where you have to face the unexpected. But there's ways of, I guess there's ways of how I approach image, how I approach space, how I approach the world of objects, which still has some resonance in my formative years. It comes from there. I know that, and I guess it has to do with maybe your reference to modernism has to do with a certain kind of like ordering of things. You know? You know what? Should I say it? I still believe in the relevance of beauty, and I know it's a very unfashionable word to pronounce, but I'm, and it can be redefined, you know, and I've that book I showed you earlier about the vital beauty, you know, revisiting visual arts in the context of technology and nature. It's very interesting because what he speaks about is a concept of sympathy and empathy, you know, to replace that word. And I think that's what, you know, when I speak to you about an aesthetic of atmosphere or you know, the condition of a space, or you know, creating climatic spaces, I think one can think about this you know, this concept of empathy, where you approach, you know, you approach the work in a sensed kind of manner. So, you know, if you want to call it, like, if you want to call this, you know, these arrangements beautiful, I mean, it's your prerogative. But for me, that's how it's, you know, the sense of beauty still, you know, is still relevant in you know, in the visual arts language and beyond. I mean, you know, yeah.
It's been suggested that with respect to artworks, that the definition you might even say of an artwork is that you approach an argument through the draw of beauty.
Perhaps. No, you know, it's very interesting because I give classes. I'm around young students, and this is not a fashionable word to use. And I'm very fascinated still by, you know, by what young people can bring, you know, forward in terms of how they approach the world, you know, how I approach my world and how they see the world, and I kind of have an understanding of, like, the, you know, how they sidestepped and kind of actually speak of the abject, you know, as opposed to, you know, what I call like empathy, you know. But they live in a world of uncertainty, and, you know, I think their work reflects these changes, you know. I think, you know, if I go back to when I was their age, you know, in the early years of when I was, you know, as I say, my formative years as an artist, we were idealists. I mean, we just believed so strongly in you know, that we had our place in the world to this kind of like, you know, to art making, that we would go through fire for this. And to the point of becoming totally anti-institutional, you know. Things have changed. I mean, we live in a different world now, and these young people grow up in a different world. And they're not so idealistic anymore. They're very pragmatic. And I think their work kind of reflects changes. So for me, I mean, that's why I still really enjoy, enjoy being in a teaching situation, because I learn as much from them than they learn from me, and hopefully they learn something. But you know what? I don't, paradoxically, I don't believe in teaching art. I absolutely don't believe in that.
Eva, you mentioned paradox a moment ago, and paradox might be linked to questions of the, what can you call it, the mood, let's say, the mood by which a work proceeds. And one question might be, to what extent, apart from Sturm und Drang, apart from social critique, artworks often work through nuance, and I think you've answered to that as well very beautifully, and even comedy and humor. But a word linked to that, I think, is paradox, and I'm kind of interested in how you would respond to the thought that your work is, you might say, even largely devoted to paradox as a mood by which to proceed. Here's a quote from Goethe that I think is nicely paradoxical. You wish to know the infinite, immerse yourself in the finite.
Well, I guess it goes back to the, to this idea of quest. And where there is no, there's no finitude. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't, prevent one from going forward and trying to find something where you don't have the answer to, and you will never have the answer to. Mm. So in that sense, I mean, creating is a paradox, Mm-hmm. Because one strives for something, but that something is forever elusive. Mm-hmm. In that sense, it's paradoxical. I can't give you, it's a difficult question in terms of trying to give a concrete example. Mm-hmm.
It's been suggested that your work, at one and the same time, withholds and confounds, and yet somehow defines.
Well, it's not a given. That would be too easy. I don't think, I see this exchange of, viewer and work as an encounter, as a journey. You bring so much to the outside, and the outside brings so much to the inside. So, and what, actually the reading of the work of art, or the experience of the work of art is really happening in that in between. So, what I bring into the world through these, through these objects and spaces I create, I mean, it only goes so far, and, it goes towards somebody, towards a receiver. And, I think it really merges in between the two. And, I may have intentions, but a work is experienced through one's own life, one's own living experience. And I have no, I have no control over that. I mean, it's totally like, it's totally up to you what you want, what you want to make, what you want to make of it. I remember a little anecdote. I mean, I used to work with the form of the cross, but as a form, not not with any kind of not as a religious symbol at all. I mean, it didn't cross my mind. And I had this woman come up to me and speaking about religion, and this how she really felt the work, and she really could enter this work because of this religious symbol. And this was not part of my intention at all. But I had to, I kind of had to respect her, her interpretation, because that's where she came from. Mm-hmm. And, I think one has to welcome the experience of others. Mm. She saw it through these eyes, So I think I think the work remains open. There's so much you put into it, and then it goes out into the world, and it is received. Mm. And I really believe it's a two-way journey. And I guess my intentions is to, maybe I can make you see things differently. Or maybe you will, I want to touch you, It can also, it can also be channeled to emotions. I mean, I've been touched by some works very deeply. I've been touched by some words, I've been touched by some, images, I've been touched by some objects, I've been touched by situations. So, yeah, I mean, you only can hope that, that you can make people aware of something, a different consciousness, perhaps.
In other words, it really, the work, it would be wrong to say that a work can bring out humor particularly, or Sturm und Drang particularly, but that it can become a key to the individual viewer to search within themselves for something that actually, in some profound way, defines them.
Yeah, I'll do. I don't think my work lends itself to irony or like. No, I don't see it that, I don't make it that way, and I don't necessarily see it that way. Mm. But perhaps somebody can read that into it. And, again, it's their prerogative to do so. It doesn't bring that forward. I mean, in my opinion, it doesn't bring that forward necessarily. But there is art that is very much bringing, like humor and irony forward, and it can be quite enjoyable, Mm. And so can this be enjoyable in its own way. Mm. Mm. But it's not something that I necessarily strive for or try to.
There's something humorous about the eye of that bird searching the room. And locking onto you.
Like a specific example here. I was waiting for the question about like why are you using these subjects? Mm-hmm. The bird for me is a subject. Mm-hmm. And this whole bird series came by inadvertence. I mean, I didn't look for these subjects. It just it just circumstance made that I came across a whole cabinet of these taxidermied birds, and it was like kind of it was a total surreal moment, because it was in some attic of some convent, and I was alone by myself wandering through this building that was being renovated, and nobody knew I went up there under the over the cupola, and I opened this door and this long corridor, and this cabinet at the end of the corridor, and this all these animals looking at me, or these birds looking at me, and it was just a total surreal moment. Mm. But what I remember of that experience is the gaze of these, all these glass eyes, and the presence, they were actually looking at me into the eye. And and later on, I got hold of some of these specimens, and I always chose the ones that had a certain look outwards, because there's a lot of them. I mean, I wasn't interested in ducks and like that, just like a coffee table kind of, decor. I was really interested in the birds that were almost alive, you know, through the gaze. So, and the posture also, because you know, they actually fixed, right? They fixed in a certain, you know, in a certain posture, and you know, either, you know, the head sideways or looking, you know, like this character that looks over his shoulder in a very arrogant manner. I mean, they just become alive for me. And I said, okay, I mean, like here is an encounter, you know, and once they're oversized, I mean, this amplifies this kind of presence. So they became, you know, they became a presence for me. I was not interested in integrating the actual objects in my settings. They had to, you know, I had to find a second level for that. I had to bring them back in a different manner. So first of all, they're oversized, and you know, they're also very, very detailed. So there's again this idea of surface that inadvertently comes back, because you know, if I look back at my surface has been like very, very deep colored cloth, you know, but color as material, not color as light. It's just like this just the presence of the color. I was interested in that in some of the works. I touch things all the time, you know, and you know, so this for me, the surface of the plumage is like really plumage. It's like really, really important, to the point where it almost becomes tactile. You know. So here we're back, and then I, you know, like they're staged, right? They're staged in a, you know, it's like I actually take the actual birds to fabric shops, and I walk around, and I, you know, like I have to find like the background for them, and the background either, you know, it's, you know, some of them like suggests like the bark of a tree, or the, you know, like a very deep night, you know, like for the night birds particularly. And well, this one was just like to kind of like put him in this context of his redness there. So, but again, I mean, I staged them in a manner where they're nowhere in particular, but you only can imagine where they are. In the owl series, I mean, you know, they come out of this deep blue background, which is, you know, they come out of the night, and they're very ominous. And the birds of prey, I mean, this particular one is not, because I'm starting something else. The birds of prey, the night ones and the nocturnal ones and the diurnal ones are like they are in this pose of imminent either plunging towards, you know, towards the victims, or kind of just landing. So again, the pose is like is extremely important. Now, what the prey is invisible. But it's like a dance of death. You know, it's that moment of something could happen. It's a moment of suspension, if you could call it that way. Maybe I'm straying a little bit from your initial question there.
No, it occurs to me that in this ambivalent situation, the viewer almost inevitably comes back to themselves, and the sense of empathy and sympathy that perhaps we talked about earlier really becomes the viewer themselves, and the bird of prey, whatever, becomes the antagonist, protagonist.
Yeah. Well, I call them subjects. You could call them, you could call them protagonists. But they just, you know, they're again, I mean, they're in an in-between space, because they belong elsewhere. And for me, what they evoke is, you know, is of importance. The place they evoke. Again, I mean, a night bird, you will not see, you will hear. But the territorial calls conjure up a space. and you can imagine that space. So it's to in a way, it's to transport you somewhere. And when I talk about the framing and the way I'm very particular about framing these images, they're like it's so that you enter into an imaginary space.
Eva, you teach and have taught for a long time, and I know that you take the teaching extraordinarily seriously as a professional artist, not simply as a teacher. Though, of course, perhaps one must admit that in some respects an artist is a teacher. But my question really is, in the years of teaching, what has been most enjoyable for you, or what do you gain most from the experience?
I guess sharing my enthusiasm and getting some response. It's like when I get a response, and when we do something together, and when I witness these works that that the young students can make and that I get very excited about. I mean, this, it's, I guess that's the only gratifying thing, where it's the partage. That's and seeing things anew, because they're younger than I am, and they do the work from different premises, from a different premise, and that process of discovery, and also to I teach at the different levels of students, so I get different satisfactions from different from different relationships with the very young students. Like it's their capacity to wonder. They don't know about art history. They don't know about sometimes they don't even know about contemporary art because they come from a science background or from and it's just their the capacity for them to see I actually was able to do that. And me sharing that with them. It's really that two-way relationship. Because as I said earlier, I do not believe in teaching art. I mean, I can just set up. I provoke. I provoke situations where they, and I create a setting where they to make the, to encourage the creative endeavors. But they have to do it. I don't demonstrate. I don't. I give them context. I try to give them a context, but a context. It comes down to practice. There's no practice without reflection. So one has to. Because in visual arts, you're engaged in making things. So I don't teach techniques necessarily. I mean, they have technicians to go to if they want to know a particular technique. But I provide them a context to develop their ideas, and yes, I discuss with them how they could go about embody the embodiment of these ideas. And sometimes it's they come one way, I come the other way, and we have discussions. But I always I'm always aware of providing a wider context outside of just the studio situation. Which brings me to we're sitting in a studio here. What is a studio? I mean, right now it has, everybody has a different, every artist's studio is different from what you know. But for me, it's a place, it's a place where, where something comes out of nothing sometimes, where I can just, I like my white wall there that I can, that I can look at and imagine something. But it's not, a studio is just like it's just like a place where, where yes, you make things happen, or it's a place where you make mistakes, where you set problems for yourself, but this is not unique to this physical space. The studio is everywhere. It doesn't, it doesn't stop behind the closed door. When I leave and I close the door, it continues on the street. It continues in, in my upstairs. Then at home, it's ongoing.
There's the term post-studio artist, but it occurs to me as you talk about this, that in fact every artist is a post-studio artist, because perhaps the general assumption that you go at 9 o'clock to the studio and work away and leave at 5 o'clock doesn't work, perhaps never worked.
Never works.
And in fact, the studio is the larger context.
Yes, I understood post-studio practice more in terms of like this. I know a lot of artists that give up the studios now because it doesn't make sense to actually have a place where they fabricate things or they move things around or whatever. They could do it. They can do it out of their the office at home. Either because work gets sent out and is produced somewhere else or I've done that at times too. I mean, it's not everything I can do in my studio, especially that it's getting smaller and smaller. But I see a post-studio practice more in terms of the type of work one does. And some artists just do their work online. Which, on one hand, I mean, it eliminates all the material constraints. But on the other hand, I still see, I still see the virtual world. I see it with with incredible potential. But for me, it's still kind of like a practical, a tool. I don't see it in relationship to my own work as a vehicle for invention, because I'm still very interested in physical presence of things and in manipulation and in fabrication, and I still get pleasure out of this. So to do it virtually, that would make sense for me. But I can see, I mean, for me, the post-studio practice would define more the type of artist that, the kind of artist that decides to give up that practical part.
So I'm going to come back then to a point that we were discussing earlier around the question of your core concerns or interests, and the question then that I'd like to ask you about a particular work that you think would very well reflect these core interests that you've been talking about.
Okay, maybe I can talk about a more recent piece, which is Birds of Prey. They own the night, they own the day. That's the title of the piece, and it's kind of like a dual installation. It's like two settings that share one space, with images, with three-dimensional elements and sound. So because you don't have the piece in front of you, I can shortly, describe it in terms of like the night birds, which are the owls. There's the female bird, there's the female owl, there's the male owl, and they're like oversized images, and in between you have these megaphone type conical shapes, and they also are facing each other. So when you, again, earlier on I said that the parcours of the viewer, the displacement of the viewer is important. in the way I set up things. I kind of can lead you to objects by the way I set them up. So there is a sound element that is triggered off by displacement. So if you're in the vicinity of one bird, it will call the other bird. So these are basically like recordings of territorial calls, and it will only happen if you're in the vicinity of one image or in the vicinity of the other image. It's not ongoing. So you trigger it off through senses. This for me is like a way of conjuring up yet another space, not the space you're in, but the space that's beyond. And I guess it's, you know, it will trigger off your imaginary. It's an imaginary space. It's not a physical space. I think sound can do that. You know, it certainly can. You know, can help to do that because it's a very, you know, it's a very concrete experience. So you have this event at one, you know, in one part of the room, and then you have this sort of like division, which again I divide the nocturnal birds from the diurnal birds with a kind of like a so-called curtain, but it's actually, again, it's like a physical element. It's like a constructed, you know, partition, you know, and it's these long, you know, these long tubes, almost look like organ tubes, and they're like, you know, they're covered with this very, you know, like ochres and you know, sort of like forest type of colors, you know. So they could look like trees, but again, I mean, I'm resisting any kind of like you know, literal representation here. But you could see them in the verticality as just like a row of trees, you know, that separates these, you know, this grouping from that grouping. So again, there's this binary kind of, you know, situation where you have like with the daybirds, you have like the two, like you have here in the image, like these two tall. Swiveling mirror elements, which are not really, you know, they're not really mirrors, but they still have a reflective surface. So, and the birds are, en français on dit aux aguets, they're like, they're on watch, yeah. So being on watch is having your eye, very, you know, it's a very astute kind of eye, and the perforation in the mirror is a way, it's very incisive, right? It's like, it's really, you know, it's a clean hole. And this incisiveness is also like the, you know, it could mirror the incisiveness of that eye that watches. But there's more than that, you know, there's more happening as you circumvent these elements, and, you know, like you're in a certain position in the space, you will look through that opening, and you will actually see the eye of the bird. Now, this is only happening because of the strategic placement of this element of it. So I move things around, and you know, you might see it or you might never see it. You know, it's up to if you want to pay attention. Mm-hmm. But I set up, you know, I'm very interested in the implicit way of apprehending a work. You know. I shun explicitness. I want you to discover, or, you know, if you don't discover, then something else may happen. So, I set up situations. I could say that's what I try to do. You know, I try to set up certain situations, and that's what I'm doing with that particular piece. You know, it's not different today in a way. Yes, I mean, if the collector comes and wants to buy my work, of course I will sell it, you know, because I can use the money to do some more, you know. But I see the market, you know, I see the market and the, you know, like the collectors and all that. I see this as a very, very different kind of like this is another world, you know. And I will never do I will never do work to sell, to fit into that world. I mean, if it happens, it happens. You know, if it's unfortunate enough that it can happen, it will happen. But I will never do it for those reasons. So you know, scale down because it's, you know, I can sell it. You know, or make additions because I can sell it. You know. Or, you know, somebody actually approached me and, you know, with those large photographs and said, we really would like to have one of your large photographs. And I said, well, no, we can't have it because this doesn't exist as an image, you know. It's part of something much bigger, and either you take everything or you know, you can't have it. Because I don't consider it as a product and that can be, you know, like it's like a sentence, you know, and you take some words out and the meaning can change, you know. So you can isolate, you know, I want to allow it to be isolated. Although, you know, yes, I could make an edition of 5 and, you know, and then sell them. But I don't do that. Unless I would be really, no, I wouldn't do it. No. It has to do with the integrity of the work.
But I'm interested by this question of integrity or authenticity, or the authentic. And I hear you talking, Eva, very much in terms of the authentic parameters of a specific work, the integrity of its coherence, I guess. Mm-hmm. And yet we live in a contemporary times that seems to have disintegrated this question of the authentic or the integrity of the specific, and constructed through especially through current technologies, constructed a kind of I don't know, everything all the time here.
Oh, I see where you're getting at.
Yeah. what do you think about that?
You mean I can, you know, I can truquer, which means I'm thinking about documentation now. You know, I can make appear in my work that I'm not really there. Is that what you're talking about? Like in terms of like the way it gets disseminated?
Yeah, but yes, I suppose. Yeah, maybe dissemination is the key to this. We have Instagram, we have Facebook, we have, and of course, in a larger picture, we have this incredible fragmentation, you might say, that has been, in some respects, a dissolution of the coherent subject. I don't want to get too technical about this, but at the core of how you understand your work, when you use the word integrity...
You know, it brings me to something when I was talking about the younger artists, the younger generation today. And there's a lot of collaboration. Mm-hmm. You know, the more and more so, there's, you know, people, either duos or people working together. And then that question of authenticity can come in as well in terms of like, you know, whose work is it, you know. I find that very fascinating. This sort of like this communal type of, you know, way of creating work. And I couldn't do it. I don't know how I would do it. Maybe you know, maybe with a particular project, but you know, I've been asked to collaborate with some people, and I've you know, I've never been too hot for it. You know, although I'm fascinated by how it's happening now, and I don't know if it's a question of survival. I don't know if it's just a question of like how the artwork is made now. You know, where there's, you know, contributions from, you know, on different kind of levels. But I certainly noticed that in you know, like in the, even going to, you know, we're going to go to the Biennale in a couple of days, and I bet there's a lot of, you know, tags on the wall that will say like, you know, will have more than one name, you know. And this is fairly, you know, like it's quite significant in terms of like how work is done now. So one could, you know, talk about authenticity in those terms as well. But, well, are we talking about authorship? I don't know. You know.